They said nothing, and it destroyed him more than anything he'd ever screamed at her. There's a moment that happens in almost every confrontation with a manipulative person, a moment where they're expecting a reaction, waiting for it, almost hungry for it, and the moment doesn't come. No defense, no tears, no raised voice, just silence. And if you've never watched what that silence actually does to a person who thrives on control, you're about to understand why it might be the single most powerful response a human being has access to. Today we're talking about why staying quiet, real, deliberate, chosen silence, isn't weakness, isn't avoidance, isn't letting them win. It's often the exact opposite. It's the response that takes the entire game away from someone who was counting on you to keep playing it. Let's start with why this feels so counterintuitive, because I think that's actually the key to understanding why it works. We're taught, almost from childhood, that silence equals defeat, that the person who has something to say back is the one who wins the argument, that staying quiet when you've been wronged means you're letting the other person get away with something. This belief runs so deep that most of us instinctively feel a kind of panic when we're being provoked, and our first impulse is to explain, defend, correct, respond, anything except stay still. But here's what almost nobody tells you. That instinct to respond is exactly what a manipulative or narcissistic person is counting on. Your reaction is the entire point of the provocation. Take the reaction away, and you haven't lost the exchange. You've removed the only thing they were actually trying to get from you. This is worth sitting with for a second because it reframes everything that follows. When someone provokes you, an insult, a jab, a deliberately unfair accusation, they're rarely doing it because they genuinely need an answer to a genuine question. They're doing it to produce a specific effect in you. Defensiveness, anger, tears, over-explanation, anything that confirms they still have influence over your internal state. That influence is the actual currency in these interactions. Facts are almost beside the point. What they want is proof that they can still move you. Silence denies them that proof completely. Let's talk about what happens physiologically and psychologically to a person who is trying to provoke someone and gets nothing back. This is genuinely fascinating once you understand it, because it explains why silence lands so much harder than any comeback ever could. A person who provokes deliberately has usually rehearsed, consciously or not, an entire script in their head for how the interaction is supposed to go. They say the cutting remark, you flinch or fire back, they escalate, you escalate, and the whole exchange builds toward a climax where they either win by making you look unreasonable or they extract the emotional reaction they were fishing for in the first place. When you don't follow the script, when you simply don't provide your half of the exchange, something genuinely destabilizing happens to them. The rehearsed sequence has nowhere to go. There's no momentum to build on, no reaction to escalate against, no defensiveness to twist into, see, I told you they were being unreasonable. The entire performance collapses because it required an audience that was actively participating, and you've quietly stepped out of the role. This is why so many people report that staying silent in the face of provocation doesn't just protect them. It visibly unsettles the other person, sometimes far more than any argument would have. You'll see it in their face, a flicker of confusion. Sometimes anger, because your calm reads to them as a kind of control they don't have, which is deeply uncomfortable for someone whose whole identity is built on being the one in control. Sometimes they'll escalate harder, throwing more insults, more provocations, trying increasingly aggressive tactics to get a reaction out of you, precisely because the absence of one is so intolerable to them. And when none of it works, when you simply remain steady, something in the dynamic shifts permanently. They learn, on some level, that this particular tactic doesn't work on you anymore. Now, I want to be really clear about something because there's an important distinction that gets lost in a lot of advice about staying quiet, and getting this wrong can actually hurt you instead of protect you. Strategic silence is not the same as suppression. It's not swallowing your feelings, pretending you're fine when you're not, or staying silent because you're too scared to speak up. That version of silence is corrosive. It builds resentment. It erodes your sense of self over time. and it's often actually a trauma response rather than a chosen strategy. The silence we're talking about today is different. It's active, not passive. It's a decision made from a place of clarity, not fear. It says, I see exactly what you're doing, and I am choosing not to give you what you want, which is a completely different internal experience than, I don't know what to say, so I'll just say nothing. One comes from power, the other comes from a lack of it, and learning to tell the difference in your own body, in the moment, is actually one of the most important skills in this entire practice. So how do you actually tell the difference in real time when emotions are running high and everything in you wants to either explode or shut down completely? The first marker is whether you're choosing the silence or collapsing into it. Chosen silence has a certain steadiness to it. You're present, your breathing is relatively even, you're making eye contact if that feels safe, and there's a clear internal reason behind your choice not to speak. Collapsed silence usually comes with a different physical signature entirely, a kind of freezing, a dissociative blankness, a feeling of being unable to speak rather than choosing not to. If what you're experiencing is the second one, that's not a strategy, that's a nervous system in distress, and it deserves compassion and support, not a reframe into empowerment. Learning to recognize which one you're in is often something that takes real practice, sometimes with the help of a therapist who specializes in trauma responses, because the two can feel deceptively similar from the inside until you've done the work to tell them apart. The second marker is what happens after. Chosen, strategic silence generally leaves you feeling more grounded once the interaction is over, a little tired maybe, but clear, intact, like you made a decision you can stand behind. Collapsed silence usually leaves a residue of shame, a replaying of the moment in your head with 100 things you wish you'd said, a feeling of having disappeared rather than having chosen restraint. If you consistently notice that second pattern after these interactions, that's valuable information. It's telling you that what's happening isn't a strategy working in your favor. It's an old survival pattern activating, and that's worth addressing directly rather than reframing as strength. Assuming you are in a position to choose, where you have enough safety, enough distance, enough internal steadiness to actually decide how you want to respond, here's what deliberate, strategic silence actually looks like in practice, because it's more specific than just saying nothing. It starts with recognizing the provocation the instant it happens, before your body has fully committed to a reactive spiral. This is a skill that improves with practice. Noticing the tightening in your chest, the heat rising in your face, the urge to immediately correct or defend. And instead of acting on that urge, pausing just long enough to ask yourself one question: what does this person actually want from me right now? Almost every time, the honest answer is some version of a reaction, and naming that to yourself, even silently, even for half a second, is often enough to interrupt the automatic response and create a small gap where choice becomes possible. From there, the silence itself doesn't have to be total or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like simply not responding to a text for a while, instead of firing back the moment your thumbs are able to move. Sometimes it looks like a single brief acknowledgement, okay, or noted, or even just a neutral nod, instead of the 20-sentence defense you feel building in your throat. Sometimes it looks like physically leaving the room, calmly, without an announcement or a dramatic exit line, simply removing yourself from an exchange that has stopped being productive. What all of these have in common is that they refuse to hand over the thing being fished for, without requiring you to perform anger, tears, or icy contempt in the process. The power of the silence comes precisely from how undramatic it is. Drama, even the drama of a dignified, righteous exit, is still a reaction. True strategic silence is almost boring by comparison, and that's exactly what makes it so hard for a provocateur to counter. In part 2, we're going to get into exactly when silence stops being the right tool and something else is needed instead. The specific situations where staying quiet can actually be misread or even weaponized against you, how to protect yourself from that. And this is the part I think will matter most if you've ever been accused of giving someone the silent treatment, when what you were actually doing was protecting your own peace. The crucial difference between the silent treatment as a manipulation tactic and strategic silence as a boundary. Those two things get confused constantly, and understanding the difference is going to change how confidently you can use this tool going forward. Stick around, because that part is where this becomes something you can actually trust yourself to use in real situations without second-guessing it. Let's talk about when silence stops working, because it doesn't always, and pretending otherwise would leave you unprepared for exactly the situations where a different tool is required. The first situation where strategic silence isn't the right move is when you're dealing with someone who has actual power over your safety, your finances, your custody arrangements, or your livelihood, and silence could be interpreted or deliberately misrepresented as agreement or admission. In a workplace conflict, for instance, staying silent when a boss makes a false accusation in front of others isn't strategic. It can actually be read later as tacit acceptance of the narrative, especially if there's no written record countering it. In these situations, the right move isn't silence at all. It's calm, factual, documented pushback, a follow-up email, a brief correction in the moment, something that creates a paper trail. Silence protects your internal state. It doesn't always protect your external record. And in situations with real institutional stakes, the record matters as much as your peace of mind. The second situation is co-parenting or any relationship where children are involved, and silence could be misread by a court, a mediator, or the kids themselves as disengagement or indifference. If a narcissistic co-parent accuses you, in front of a mediator, of something untrue, silence there isn't strength. It's a missed opportunity to state the truth clearly for a record that will actually matter later. This is a case where brief, factual, unemotional correction serves the exact same underlying goal as strategic silence, refusing to hand over an emotional reaction, while still protecting your interests in a way that pure silence wouldn't. The third situation, and this one is subtle, is when silence starts being used against you as evidence of guilt or wrongdoing by someone who already has an audience primed to believe the worst about you. If a manipulative person has spent months building a narrative that you're cold, checked out, or hiding something, walking straight into more silence, right when people are already watching for exactly that, can sometimes confirm the story they've been telling instead of undermining it. In these specific situations, a small amount of calm, visible engagement, showing up, being pleasant, being present in ways people can see for themselves, does more to dismantle the narrative than silence would, because it gives observers direct contradictory evidence instead of an absence they can fill in however they like. Now let's get into the distinction I promised you, because I think it's the single most important clarification in this entire two-part episode. The difference between the silent treatment as a manipulation tactic and strategic silence as a boundary. These two things look identical from the outside: quiet, withdrawn, unresponsive, and that surface similarity is exactly why so many people get accused of doing the same thing the manipulative person in their life does. But underneath, they are almost perfect opposites, and understanding the difference will let you use this tool with real confidence instead of constant self-doubt. The silent treatment, as a manipulation tactic, has a specific purpose: punishment and control. It's deployed to make the other person anxious, to force them into a state of desperate appeasement, to extract an apology or a concession through discomfort rather than through honest conversation. It's usually indefinite, with no clear endpoint communicated, which is precisely what makes it so destabilizing. The target doesn't know what they're supposed to do to end it, so they're left guessing, over-apologizing, walking on eggshells, doing anything to make the cold front lift. It's also almost always paired with continued proximity. The silent treatment giver doesn't leave, doesn't create space. They stay right there, radiating displeasure, making their presence itself into the punishment. Strategic silence, as a boundary, works in the opposite direction on almost every one of those dimensions. Its purpose isn't to punish the other person or extract something from them. It's to protect your own internal state and refuse to participate in a dynamic that isn't productive. It typically comes with either an explicit or implicit endpoint. "I'm not discussing this right now" implies a right time exists, even if it's not today. And critically, it's usually paired with actual distance, not punishing proximity. You leave the room, you end the call, you take real space rather than staying close and letting your coldness do the talking. You're not trying to make the other person suffer until they comply. You're removing yourself from an exchange that has stopped being about truth and started being about control. Here's a practical way to check yourself in the moment if you're ever unsure which one you're doing. Ask what you actually want the silence to produce. If the honest answer is, I want them to feel bad enough to change, you're closer to the silent treatment, even if your grievance is completely legitimate. If the honest answer is, I want to stop participating in something harmful and protect my own clarity, that's strategic silence, regardless of how it looks from the outside. The behavior can look nearly identical. The intention, and often the outcome, is almost entirely different. This distinction matters enormously if you've ever been accused by a manipulative partner or parent of giving them the silent treatment when what you were actually doing was declining to engage with something designed to provoke you. This accusation is, itself, a fairly common manipulation tactic, reframing your boundary as the actual offense, so that you end up apologizing for protecting yourself instead of them ever having to account for what they did to provoke that protection in the first place. If this has happened to you, I want you to hear clearly. Setting a boundary is not the same behavior as weaponizing withdrawal to control someone, even if a person determined to avoid accountability insists otherwise. Trust the internal marker, not their framing of it. There's one more piece I want to leave you with, because I think it's easy, after an episode like this, to walk away thinking silence is always the sophisticated, evolved choice, and speaking up is somehow less powerful by comparison. That's not actually the lesson here. Strategic silence is one tool among several, and it's specifically powerful in situations where speaking would only hand ammunition to someone who was never negotiating in good faith to begin with. It is not inherently superior to honest, direct communication in relationships where good faith actually exists. The entire value of strategic silence comes from correctly identifying that you're dealing with someone who treats honest communication as an opportunity for exploitation rather than connection. With people who are actually capable of hearing you, actually capable of holding space for a real conversation, silence isn't strength, it's just avoidance, and it can quietly starve a healthy relationship of the honesty it needs to survive. So the real skill this episode is pointing toward isn't always stay quiet. It's learning to read, accurately and quickly, which kind of interaction you're actually in, and having both tools available, honest engagement for relationships built on good faith, and calm, deliberate silence for the ones that aren't, so you're never stuck defaulting to the wrong one out of habit, fear, or hope that this time will be different. If you've ever used silence this way, deliberately, calmly, as a boundary instead of a wound, I'd love to hear what that moment looked like for you, because these stories genuinely help other people recognize the difference in their own lives, sometimes for the first time. And if this episode gave you language for something you've been doing instinctively without fully understanding why it worked, that's exactly what Mind Horizon is here for. Subscribe for more of this, the psychology underneath the behavior, the tools that actually protect your peace instead of just sounding good, and I'll see you in the next one.